Any time that you spend on Wizard Island, day or night, is an incredible experience. And at night when there is no moon, the starlight is sometimes bright enough that you can read a book without a light. And this place was and always should be honored as a sacred place for all the American people, and actually all the people all over the world in perpetuity.
Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where we uncover the untold stories of our national parks. Who Runs This Park is presented by Expert Voice. Gear up for adventure with Expert Voice, the outdoor gear source for industry experts. Outdoor brands like Big Agnes, Mammoth, La Sportiva, Chaco, and more offer discounts on Expert Voice of up to 60% off for industry experts like you. And you can join Expert Voice for free today and see what brands you qualify for. So, whatever the next adventure calls for, make sure you're prepared with expertvoice.com/parks and gear up for adventure. If you like chocolate, which may be a red flag if you don't, you have to try out Ritual Chocolate. Ritual Chocolate is my favorite chocolate brand by far, and I learned about them from spending a lot of time in Park City, Utah, where they're based nearby, and actually got to take my family to a chocolate tasting at their factory. And it totally changed the way we all think about and eat small batch chocolate. While I already loved the bars, it opened up my world to the variety and depth of flavor profiles chocolate can have. I'm excited to be sharing this with you all. Who Runs This Park listeners get 10% off their online purchases of Ritual Chocolate. Go to ritualchocolate.com, that's RITUAL chocolate.com, and use promo code WRTP for 10% off. You'll be thanking me later, I promise. And did I mention that I'm obsessed with their packaging? It's so beautiful, so even just having the bars and opening them is a treat. Get on it and order some chocolate. Today we have Craig Ackerman with us, Crater Lake Superintendent. Crater Lake National Park is located in southern Oregon, and the lake itself is the deepest lake in the U.S., and its deep blue color comes from its purity and clarity. I myself look forward to the day I can see Crater Lake with my own eyes, and as we'll talk about later in our interview, it's a view that a man saw and worked tirelessly for 17 years to ensure it was preserved and named a national park. Craig himself has extensive experience at Crater Lake, having been superintendent for the past 15 years, and has additional experience across the Park Service. One quote from an interview of Craig's sets the scene for his heart for his job and care for our national parks. "After all, it's your park, it's not mine. I'm simply managing it for you. I'm the caretaker. The park belongs to the public. It belongs to the people of this country, which in itself is a pretty neat concept." Craig, welcome to Who Runs This Park. It's a joy to have you here today.
Great to be here. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Our discussion today is, in a couple of your interviews, you paint a beautiful picture of Crater Lake. Can you share some of the experiences of the national park in different seasons? It's the lake that's coined the Mirror of Heaven.
We like to say that Crater Lake has two seasons, winter and August, but there are a few more nuances than that. It is a park shaped by ice, snow, and water, as well as fire. We like to say that Crater Lake has that juxtaposition of fire and ice that you've seen in recent movies and TV series, because the park, or the lake itself, was created, of course, by a volcanic eruption, and almost all of the landscapes around the park are shaped by volcanism and fire. Fire has been a part of history of Crater Lake since before it was born, since it was Mount Mazama. This is fire ecology out in the Pacific Northwest. So fires typically burn through the forest and shape the understory and the overstory. That has been changed over the last 100 years or so, when we viewed fire as a bad thing and constantly put it out. So now we have an imbalance in that. And we have forests that are choked with a lot of underbrush and things that typically would have burned out. But fire formed the surface, but water, snow, and ice also create the environment that makes Crater Lake what it is, both on land, terrestrial environment, and in the water, the lake itself. All of the water that is in the lake falls directly into the caldera in the form of snow, and more recently, due to climate change, rain. But there are no streams in or out of the lake. One of the reasons for its clarity and purity is the fact that there are no sediments being brought into the lake. So snow starts falling anywhere after the middle of September and can fall all the way until the middle of June. And I will tell you right now that despite the incredible heat wave that we have had in the West, with temperatures in the surrounding valleys up to 115 degrees, we still have some significant patches of snow left at Crater Lake. And on most years, when we have a
Wow.
typical year, we will have snow at the bottom of the avalanche chutes inside the caldera all year long. It will never dissipate. So most of the creatures and plants that live at Crater Lake are adapted to that sort of harsh environment. Some places in the park we get drifts on Rim Drive that are up to 40 feet deep in the wintertime. So animals have to figure out a way to live, then come out when the short summer begins in June or July before the frost comes along and the snow starts falling again in August or September.
Wow. I had read that in, I think it was second grade, you saw a magazine article showing snow piled 2 stories high at Crater Lake, and recall you had never seen anything like it, hoping to see it one day. I think the first thing that comes to mind is it's clear that it snows a lot at Crater Lake. I was not aware of that until I started researching and then even you talking about it more. But can you tell me about that memory the first time you saw a picture of Crater Lake?
Oh, sure. And a lot of people don't understand when we say it snows a lot at Crater Lake. They think, oh, yes, we understand it snows a lot. The snow is on the ground probably after the first part of December, a minimum of 8 to 10 feet deep for the rest of the winter. The only place you can go is on roads that have been plowed, which have 10, 12, 15-foot snowbanks along the side of them, or skiing. And of course, I recall that memory. It was a weekly reader magazine that we received at school every week in the second grade. And there was a story in that magazine about Crater Lake and a photo of a ranger who was surrounded by these huge evergreen trees, but he was skiing past the top of a cabin with only its chimney sticking out of the snow.
Wow.
Being from an area where I never saw snow like that back in the eastern United States and West Virginia, I was just fascinated. But what kind of added to that mystique is that my father was a World War II veteran who got his basic training at Fort Vancouver, Washington, and in Camp Adair, Oregon. So he often reminisced us with tales of Oregon and Washington and the wonderful people and places that he experienced here. Notwithstanding, he said sometimes that he was in knee-deep mud and eating mashed potatoes with frozen mutton gravy on cold metal plates.
Oh my gosh.
But that still instilled in me a curiosity about the Pacific Northwest. And with those photographs and with the National Geographic magazines and books and encyclopedias and booklets that my folks always provided for us, there were packets of photos that had scenes from parks and countries all around the world. And I just love those books. I love those photographs. There's really no truer statement than a book is a vessel that can take you to lands far away. And I was always fascinated with geography and new places. My mom was an immigrant from Italy. My father's parents both emigrated from Germany and Wales, so I was always interested in Europe and alpine locations, and Crater Lake fit right into that. About age 7, my family started traveling around the country by car. First, we would spend time with friends who were ministers on the Ojibwa Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota. And after that, we would take 7,500-mile trips in a Rambler station wagon, pulling a tent trailer and visiting different national parks all across the West. So all of that tied into that second grade impression that I received of Crater Lake and the parks in the Rockies and the Pacific Northwest and how different they were than the life that I was living.
Yeah. Can you share about the first time you saw Crater Lake in person? Did it live up to the, images you had seen over the years?
Well, I had never seen a photograph of Crater Lake when I was young. I just saw photos of the snow of Crater Lake. But of course, after I'd gotten into the Park Service, I was familiar with Crater Lake as a national park. And what I will tell you is that we call it sucking wind. The Crater Lake Rangers who interpret say that when someone walks up to the rim of the caldera for the first time, they just take a deep breath because the scene is so surrealistic. It doesn't look like it can possibly be an actual feature on the landscape. We had the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, came with the governor last year in the summer, and we took him up to one of the overlooks for his first glimpse of Crater Lake, and it was the one that was over Phantom Ship. And Doug turned around and said, "This looks like it's computer generated. It's so fascinating, it can't be real." And that's the impression that most people have when they step up to Crater Lake for the first time. I was superintendent at Oregon Caves, and the superintendent at Crater Lake invited me over. And the first time I came around the bend and looked at the lake, I will tell you, I had that same sucking air experience that most people have. It's kind of like going to the Grand Canyon and stepping to the edge for the first time.
Yeah, I would imagine I would not be unique in that. I would also have the sucking air
Yeah,
experience.
the water
So I look
is
forward
so
to seeing
blue
it.
most of the time in the summer when it's clear. It has moods. It can be navy blue, it can be gray, but sometimes, most of the time in the summer, it's this electric royal blue that is so intense it looks like it's painted on the surrounding pink,
Wow.
yellow, and brown cliffs. So it's something, if you haven't seen it in person, people say photographs don't do it justice. And I
Yeah,
believe
they
that.
rarely
If
do.
you don't get the sense of scope, the lake is 6 miles across by 5 miles across. But when you look at it, you don't get that sense because the cliffs are immense. They're 2,000 feet tall in some places. And it's just a startling experience if you haven't seen it before. And I will mention that an internet company did a research last summer and said that based on the number of times the word beautiful, spectacular, wondrous, magnificent was mentioned, they rated Crater Lake as the most beautiful park of all the national parks in the United States. I would
Interesting.
say that's arguable, but it certainly is one of the top parks for scenery and beauty.
Well, and I think that goes back to William Steele's story of the person who kind of persisted to make Crater Lake a national park. And only a place of such beauty could warrant that type of dedication. So I'm not surprised by that finding.
Was just about to say that Steele was so persistent that I understand that the congressman would see that he was in the halls and order their aides to shut and lock the doors so that he could not come in and pester them again about creating a national park in Oregon. And even back then, in the late 1800s, when Steele started his first efforts to make the park come into existence, there were the same questions and the same arguments and reasoning that there are today. There were people that said, well, there may be minerals in the area. There may be something in the lake that's valuable that we could extract. So if you look at the congressional legislative history, you'll see that there was a back and forth, even though now we would never question creating a national park at Crater Lake. There is always a political influence as to what is the best for the people of the country. Is it preservation or use? And our mandate struggles because we have both of those in it. It's both preservation of the resources and providing for visitor use.
Could you provide a little bit? Obviously, I was in preparing, read a little bit about William Steele's persistence and the history of Crater Lake. But for those who are not familiar, could you give a little spiel of kind of, you alluded to it a bit, of Steele fighting for it to be deemed a national park, but could you give a little bit more context to that history?
Steele was, I guess, similar to my experience. He was allegedly this, we're not sure if this is absolutely true or not. It may be urban legend, but the story is that he was unwrapping a sandwich. And in the wrapping, there was a photograph of Crater Lake. And he became fascinated with it. And he came out. And once he saw it, he made it his life's ambition to protect it as a national park. And remember, at that time, there were only a couple of national parks. Yellowstone created in 1876. Then you had Yosemite, Sequoia, and Mount Rainier. Well, Mount Rainier wasn't created till 1900, and Will Steele started his efforts, his quest, prior to those parks even coming into existence. So there were 2 or 3 national parks at the time. And he absolutely spent his life, 15, 20 years, lobbying people in Congress and trying to convince them of how spectacular it was. Similar to the stories that people heard when the first explorers came back from Yellowstone, and they thought that they were hallucinating when they described the beauty and the geologic formations and the fascination that they had with the areas. Steele did the same. People thought that it was a lot of hype, that it was probably just a nice lake in the mountains. And then when folks started actually seeing it, they would take 2 and 3 day quests just to get a glimpse of the lake. And that was all because of Steele and his efforts to publicize it and make it well known and protect it. So Steele spent over a decade lobbying Congress, going back to Washington, D.C. in person, as I said, pounding on congressmen's doors and trying to get this area set aside as a protected area in a national park.
Yeah, I mean, you talking about it is just very rapidly increasing my desire to see it for myself. So we're going to have to figure out how that can happen on the sooner side of things. Jumping back to your role as superintendent, can you share one of the craziest situations you've dealt with as Crater Lake superintendent? I'm sure there's a lot.
Yeah, when you get 500,000 or 750,000 people a year, many of which aren't used to being in that environment, you can get all kinds of things happening. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the wildest situations that we encountered had to do with a young couple who was moving to Southwest Oregon, and they wanted to stop
Mm-hmm.
and see Crater Lake along the way. So they came in through the north entrance of the park, and they stopped at an overlook called Glacial Scratches, which is a very beautiful overlook on the west side of the park. You have Wizard Island down in front of you over 1,000 feet down the cliff. So they parked their Volkswagen Jetta and they got out to look at the overlook, and they heard people shouting, and they turned around and they saw their Volkswagen Jetta backing out of the parking spot. It went out into the roadway. It did a 180-degree U-turn, and then it backed out in the 6-foot opening of the rock wall guardrail and tumbled 1,000 feet down the cliff, end over end, into the lake. And the people screamed, "Our dog is in the car." And folks went down and who witnessed it said they saw the car tumbling end over end. The doors blew off of it. The sunroof blew off of it, and they saw something white pop out of one of the openings. And sure enough, they looked over down into the lake. Again, this is 1,000 feet down a cliff, and they saw a little white dot moving, and it was working its way gradually back up to the rim of the caldera, and it was their dog, Lucky, who made it all the way back with some bruises, bumps, and lacerations, but they weren't major. They took him to the vet, and he was fine. But when we fished the car out of 35 feet of water with a helicopter, it had turned the Volkswagen Jetta literally into a cube of metal that you see if you go to one of the auto recyclers. So it was very strange,
How?
very fortunate for the dog that the doors came off on the way down.
Oh my gosh. The helicopter must have been the only way to get the car out just because of the steep cliffs, right?
Well, the car sat in the lake until we negotiated with the insurance company to take it out because it's very expensive to remove it. And all of the wheels came off. The engine came out.
Oh my
The
God.
drivetrain came out. The transmission came out. All of this was scattered all along the walls of the caldera. The only thing that made it into the lake was literally the cube of metal from the frame of the car. So we had to have divers go down and attach cables to the cube and bring it out. But then the helicopter had to go down and hook to all of the car parts that they could to fish them out of the ledges and the crevices where they had lodged along the caldera wall.
Wow. Were the divers Park Service employees, or did you have to
Yes.
hire
Yeah,
divers?
we have
Okay.
Park Service divers who work on
Okay.
the park boats and the research boat in the lake.
Oh, I didn't know there was a park boat.
Yeah, we have
Is it
a
for
couple
search
of
and
park
rescue?
boats. There are 3 concession boats. They were just replaced last
Oh,
year
okay.
with a nice new fleet of boats for tours. And then we have a couple of boats that are research vessels that are used for the long-term ongoing research in the lake that started back in 1986 as mandated by Congress. But also they're used for search and rescue of people that get themselves into trouble when they illegally climb into the caldera at one point or another.
What type of research do you all do in the lake?
Well, there was an incident back in the late 70s and early 80s where there was a break in a sewage line, and there was some fear that there was some contamination getting into the lake and that might affect the lake's water quality and purity and clarity. And also, at that time, there were massive parking lots that were built right up to the edge of the caldera in Rim Village. There was some concern that there may be some automotive products, oil, antifreeze, things like that getting into the lake. So Congress authorized a 10-year study on the limnology of the lake and the chemistry. And we partnered with Oregon State University, and it's now been 38 years of research. And we have a massive amount of data into the chemistry of the lake, into the flora and fauna that are in the lake. Obviously, because there were no outlets when it was a mountain and then it was created as a lake in a caldera, there were no native fish. But the Park Service, in its what it then thought was its wisdom, decided, well, let's put some fish in here to give people something to do for recreation. So they stocked it with 6 species of trout and salmon and said, well, don't worry about it because they can't survive. They need a rushing stream in order to reproduce. And then in the 1920s, they decided that the fish were too small and there's not enough to eat because the lake is so clear and there's so little flora and fauna in the lake that's native, that they brought in invasive crayfish. They brought in crayfish from surrounding streams and lakes and stocked those. And now those have exploded in population. We have hundreds of millions of them in the lake, and they are threatening some of the endemic and native species and possibly could impact the clarity of the water because there are so many of them. But those are the basic research that we do. We test water chemistry, clarity every year. Divers go down. In 1988, I believe, and late 1980s, we had a one-man submersible submarine that went all the way down to the bottom of the lake. And
No
he said,
way.
even though he couldn't see at 2,000 feet deep, he couldn't see out. There was a pennant on top of the submarine, and he said he could see the pennant silhouetted against the sky above him, which meant the light was penetrating all the way down to the bottom of the lake, 2,000 feet deep. And he found some interesting things. He found some big biological mats of bacteria, and there are many lakes inside that bacteria with more dense water than the surrounding lakes. So it looks like you have miniature crater lakes in this bacterial mat at the bottom. There's also a massive...
What does that mean? Does that mean that there's indents of additional lakes covered by a bacterial mat?
Well, all of the organic material that's in the lake, when it dies, it settles down to the bottom. It's made these over 7,000 or 8,000 years bacterial mats of organic material, and they're white.
Interesting.
And within those mats, there are these indentations that look like lakes with really dark blue water in them. And we're not really sure what causes those. But of course, it's very silty at the bottom of the lake because there's been a lot of deposition and there are no currents, no real currents at the bottom. But in addition to that, around Wizard Island, there's a massive mat of moss. And some of it dates back almost as old as the caldera itself. So it may be among some of the oldest living things on the planet. Some of the moss could be up to 6,000 or 7,000 years old. And the water is so clear that it doesn't begin until about 100 meters down, and it extends for so many meters, and then it stops when the water gets too cold and lacks enough sunlight to provide it nourishment. But it's a really interesting feature of the lake that not many people know, that there's a massive moss field that surrounds Wizard Island. So they do research on that. They're doing research on the invasive crayfish and the impacts that they're having on the Mazama newt, which is the only endemic species that we have in the park, as well as collecting water quality data, limnological data that will indicate to us any impacts that may be coming from the warming of the water due to climate change, and the fact that the lake's clarity depends in part on it turning over, with colder water sinking and pushing warmer water up from the bottom in the wintertime. And with the change in environmental temperatures at the surface, that turnover of water may be changing. It may be coming faster, it may be coming slower, it may be coming longer or shorter periods of time. So that's the type of research that they do on the lake itself. And we have terrestrial research throughout the park on a variety of flora and fauna issues.
With the invasive species, are there efforts to want to remove that from the lake, or is it
the public would love to have
challenging?
it removed, and we regularly get comments about, why don't you just trap them all out and sell them? Well, there are several 100 million in the lake, and we did some pilot projects. We did some pilot projects on trapping. Initially, it was thought that crayfish don't like to cross open water, so that they would spread simply by traveling around the inside of the shoreline of the caldera. But with research, we found that they had crossed open water. And not only that, they don't stay on the surface. The crayfish have been found as deep as 700 feet into the water.
Wow.
So trapping out hundreds of millions of crayfish that can go 700 feet deep in the water is not a practical solution. And it's not, a lot of folks think it would be a commercially viable situation, but there are no roads down to the lake. So how would you trap them on a commercial basis, and how would you remove them? You would have to helicopter them out, and it's not economically feasible to do so. But most importantly of all, we did a pilot program on trapping around the Phantom Ship in a couple of areas where there were very high populations. What they found over the several-year study was the more they trapped, the greater the population grew.
What?
Yeah. We don't know whether that was a relationship relating to when you remove several species, they reproduced more because there was more food available for those that were remaining, or exactly what the situation was. But the study that they conducted definitely showed that the efforts of trapping increased the population of the crayfish instead of decreased it. And of course, it's impossible to treat the lake with any kind of pesticide like we do like rotenone or something, because there are 5 trillion gallons of water in the lake. And it would take the world supply many times over to be able to eradicate all of the biological species, number one. And number two, we're a national park. We don't do that.
I know. I was going to say, I don't know if that's aligned with the mission of the national park.
Yes, does not align. So we're finding a way to live with them, which may include developing refugia for the Mazama newt and the endemic species so that they have places where they can survive that the crayfish cannot go.
What is the Mazama newt? What type of animal
The Mazama newt is a rough-bellied newt, rough-backed newt that exists all around the park in a different variety. But the species inside the lake has become isolated, much like species in Australia and New Zealand did for almost 8,000 years. So it has evolved different traits. It doesn't have some of the same protection mechanisms that the newts outside the Mazama caldera have. It doesn't have quite the same level of poisons and toxins. So it's more sensitive and more subject to extirpation from the lake, due to the fact that over the last 8,000 years, it's lost its need to provide as many defenses because there are no predators in Crater Lake until the crayfish.
Are the crayfish eating the newts?
The fish that we stock do prey on the newts, but much less so than the crayfish. The newts stay in very shallow water where the crayfish live. The trout now eat mostly crayfish. Our aquatic ecologist said, we're doing a study, which they do every year, on the fish populations, when they gill net them and they cut a couple of trout open. They found in the trout crayfish through their entire digestive system, from one sticking in its mouth all the way through the digestive system to the very end where it comes out. It was lined up with like 17 or 18 crayfish.
That's crazy. Oh my gosh.
It's a good source of food, but not the thing that we like to do in national parks. We learn sometimes that things that sounded like a great idea were not such a great idea. That's why sometimes we're very cautious in when we make changes in the national park system, because they have long-term ramifications for the environment.
Well, and the definition of conservation has changed over the past 100 years. And so in Yellowstone in the 60s, they used to have people watch bears eat out of trash cans.
They did that at Crater Lake too. They set up platforms where they would feed the bears for entertainment.
Yeah.
And
very different.
Yes, we don't do that anymore.
No, no. And fishing is allowed in the lake, correct? Because
the fish are non-native. There's not a single native species in the lake. Fishing is permitted, no license is required, and there's no limit. The only restriction is that you may not use any sort of organic baits. You have to use artificial lures only.
Oh, that makes sense.
Fishing can be pretty good because we don't want anything else introduced into the lake. That's why we also currently have prohibition on any private watercraft, boats, kayaks, flotation devices, snorkeling gear, because all of those can bring in larvae and eggs from invasive species like quagga mussels, and that would change the environment of the lake completely and could possibly change the color of the lake. And that would be a catastrophe for everyone if that occurred.
Yes. Yeah, you have to preserve the sucking air phenomena.
For sure.
Do people just fish either in a commercial boat that's certified or off the rim?
You can only fish from the shore. And there are only 2 places you can do that, because the interior of the caldera shoreline is closed to the public, except at Cleetwood Cove, which is where you can swim and where the boats load for the boat tours, and anywhere around Wizard Island. If you get to Wizard Island on one of their shuttles or one of their Wizard Island tours, you can walk around the entire 1 square mile of the island and fish anywhere off of the shore that you like.
That's cool. Pivoting a little bit into just your experiences in the park, can you share your favorite experience you've had in Crater Lake, either as just a visitor or as, while you are superintendent?
Well, I guess I would ask you if I have to only share one.
Pick one? No, you can. We are here to listen. So pick, some of your favorites.
So, of course, any time that you spend on the lake or on Wizard Island, day or night, is an incredible experience. Though it's not open to the public after hours, there is an occasional need for park staff to work late and remain on Wizard Island overnight. And that's just an experience not to be duplicated. The sounds and also the silence as well as moonlight, or on a
Mm.
night when there is no moon, the starlight is sometimes bright enough that you can read a book without a light. That's an
Really?
incredible experience. We have one of the darkest skies in the world at Crater Lake. Recently, Oregon Outback was listed as the largest dark sky sanctuary in the world at a little over 2 million acres. That's just east of Crater Lake. We are seeing measurements in the park itself that are even darker than the Oregon Outback Sanctuary. So we're going to
Wow.
be looking at getting night sky sanctuary designation in the next couple of years, and it's incredible. You can see 5 or 6 times as many stars from Crater Lake as you can from most other places, especially urban places.
Wow.
You can see the Milky
Wow.
Way every night unaided with the naked eye. So that's an incredible experience. Seeing the old man of the lake for the first time, and in one case, actually towing him away from the docks where he was stuck. We were afraid he might be damaged or present a threat to visitors. Just all the lake
Wait, what is that?
experiences. The old man floats around the lake on his own time, his own schedule, and his own speed. And sometimes he moves a long way day to day, and sometimes he sits in one place for days or weeks at a time. And this one particular time, he decided he was going to sit right up against the docks. And 2 factors. One, we didn't want anyone doing anything that was unsafe. And 2, we didn't want anyone doing anything that would damage him because he's been floating around the lake. It's an upright hemlock log. It's been floating around the lake for over 150 years. And it's quite a
Whoa.
miracle of science that floats upright in the lake winter, summer, spring, and fall and has not yet sunk. But any of the lake experiences are incredible.
It floats upright like this?
It's floating up instead of a log floating like most logs float in the water. It floats perpendicular to the lake. And because
What?
the water is so
That's
clear,
crazy.
you can see down to the base of the old man, and it's got a slight J hook at the bottom, but you can see 30 some feet down into the water and see him floating around like an upright bobber. And CBS Sunday Morning did a special on him a few years ago. And there's a lot of legends and history with the old man in the lake, but he has been floating upright like that and being blown around the lake by wind and currents for at least 125, 250 years. We don't know how long it was in the lake before he was first discovered in the late 1800s. It could have been there a few years. It could have been there another 100 years. But no one wants to be superintendent or manager when the old man sinks.
I know that.
So next year we're
You're
going to do a
like,
study.
please live past me.
We're going to put a GPS tracker on him and see exactly where he moves and how far he moves. Every year we're concerned because at the beginning of the year, sometimes we cannot find him and we think, uh-oh, he sunk over the winter. And sure enough, he will pop up. There's about 4 feet left sticking up out of the water. And you will find him occasionally on a boat tour if you're lucky. And you get to come up to him. We discourage touching him now. I wouldn't want to touch him because I wouldn't want to be the person that touched him last and then had him sink.
No.
But it's quite an astounding feature of nature. And there's some interesting stories. When the submarine that I told you about went down to the bottom of the lake, they decided that they would tie up the old man because they didn't want him to be a hazard of navigation. Well, at Crater Lake, the summers are almost exclusively blue sky with virtually zero rain from June to the end of September. Well, they tied the old man up and thunderstorms started rolling in and the wind howled and the waves became so tall that it was not safe to operate the submarine. So they went and they untied the old man and let him float back out on the lake and the thunderstorms stopped.
Whoa. It's like an old legend.
Well, that actually happened. As to whether the thunderstorms were really
true.
That's another question.
Yeah, something to ponder.
Sometimes it's best that we not know things, that they remain a mystery.
Yeah, exactly. Any other experiences that come to mind for you?
One of the things that was most moving for me is that we had a waterfall. It's not a huge waterfall, but it's a beautiful waterfall, 35 or 40 feet tall, in a riparian area that turns into a cascade of about 100 yards. And it's just rife with wildflowers in this riparian area. And no one knew about it but park employees. So a couple of years after I came, we actually planned and developed a trail, an accessible trail out to it. And we talked with the Klamath tribe, who claimed this as part of their original territory and their homeland, and asked them to rename this falls that had been named after a surveyor in the 1950s to Crater Lake. And they named it Plaquemine Falls, and that's their word for part of their tribe that came from the high country, because this waterfall originates on Mount Scott, springs coming off of Mount Scott, the highest point in the park. So we worked with the tribe to determine the appropriate name for this little-known falls. And then once the trail was completed, they came and participated, their elders did, in a really moving ceremony to honor and dedicate the trail with their tribal elders that were there to help bless the trail on its opening. And that was a really moving experience for me. So it was one of the best things that I have experienced in the time that I've been at the park.
My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Klamath tribe held a belief that Crater Lake was really like such a holy place that actually looking upon it would lead to death. Is that?
Crater Lake is part of the creation history of the tribe. It's quite an interesting story, and there are several different variations, but we know that the tribe was there because there are artifacts that have been found under the pumice and ash that came out of Mount Mazama 7,700 years ago.
Oh.
So the Klamath people had been living in the area for probably a few thousand years at least prior to the eruption of Mount Mazama. So they saw the area before it was a lake or a caldera. And their god of the overworld, Skell, was represented by the mountain. They call it Giwas. That's what they call Crater Lake. We named it Mount Mazama much later in history, of course. And part of their legend is that the mountain also housed the god of the underworld named Lao. And Lao became infatuated with one of the Indian maidens in the tribe that was down in the Klamath Valley, and she spurned him. So Lao was sending fire and rocks down to punish the tribal people. And the god of the overworld, Skell, came out and battled with Lao to protect his people in the Klamath Valley, in the Klamath Basin. And the result of their battle was the explosion that caused the lake, the volcano dissolve and the lake to form in its place. And some of the legends say that Lao was cast down into the lake and that he came back up partly, and that Wizard Island represents the top of his hat when he reemerged from the lake. But Skell prevailed, and Lao is part of their creation story along with Skell. And they hold this park and all the area around the park in the most sacred esteem because it's holy ground for them. So we try to respect that and work with them as much as possible.
Yeah. What is your relationship with the tribe like? Do you meet with them on a certain cadence or?
Yes, we engage them as much as we can. We certainly have formal consultation requirements with the tribe. They're required by law because they are the affiliated tribe or one of the affiliated tribes to our areas. But we have been engaging with them more and more on a regular basis simply because we need partners. And they, again, this is sacred ground for them. They did not live in the park, or what's the park now, because it was sacred. You only went to the park if you were permitted to do so by one of the holiest people to do a vision quest, or you had a specific sacred reason to go to the park. So it wasn't something that you could just go up and look at for recreation. You had to have a reason to go into this sacred area. So we've been working with them on a lot of things. Currently, we're working with them on a forest management plan to reestablish the Ponderosa Pines in the southern panhandle of the park. And we did a really wonderful project with them, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service and some local ranchers, on reestablishing a stream that used to connect to the Wood River. It came out of the park and it had native bull trout in it. And when irrigation began in the early 1900s, that stream was drained for irrigation and it just ended in a field. So it was no longer connected to the Wood River or the Klamath Basin. So all the fish in the park were trapped. And the fish are part of the resources that the tribe depend on. So there was a project several years ago where we recreated the channel from Sun Creek to the Wood River, and now we have fish that are able to pass down into their native habitat in the Klamath Basin, where the Klamath tribes have rights for fishing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Can you share a little bit? I know we talked briefly before this interview about how Crater Lake has two sister parks, first being Wuyishan in China and then Trilao in Slovenia. Could you share a little bit about those relationships?
I can. The parks that we are sistered with are actually some of the most incredible parks in the world. Both of them are UNESCO biosphere reserves. Wuyishan is a double biosphere reserve, both for cultural resources and for the natural resource at the park. But back in the year 2000, we were entertaining the Consul General of China, several of the mayors and province officials at a sister state event that was occurring in Ashland, Oregon. Oregon has a sister state agreement with Fujian province in China, which is in the southeast part of the country, right across the strait from Taiwan. And in that conference, one of the state legislators and I were meeting with the consul general and some of the other government officials, and they were asking, what can we do to grow relationships in Oregon beyond the economic and business relationships we have? And I said, well, the National Park Service has a program of sister parks. And if you have a national park in Fujian province or somewhere in China, we could partner with them, exchange best practices, sometimes support each other, exchange interpretation, education. So they thought that was a pretty good idea. And because of the way the Chinese government worked, it took quite a while to get it approved. But in 2016, we went over to Wuyishan and we signed the first international sister park agreement we have with Wuyishan National Park. At the time, it was a national park in name only. But since then, President Xi has decided that he wants their national park system to be more like the United States. Previously, the national parks were run by provinces or cities or sometimes even just local tourism organizations. But he wanted a system that is truly a national system of parks. So Wuyishan, under his influence, was also selected as one of the 5 core national parks for the new Chinese national park system. Then a year later, we got a call from the embassy in Slovenia, in Ljubljana, Slovenia, wanting to know if we would be interested in partnering with their only national park, which is called Triglav. And it is located in the western part of the Julian Alps, which are the eastern part of the Julian Alps, which is the easternmost segment of the Swiss Alps. And the park is located right where Italy, Austria, and the former country of Yugoslavia, now Slovenia, come together. And he said he had read about our agreement with Wuyishan and was very interested in us partnering with them as well. And I was not familiar with the park or the geography. I should have been. And I was just picturing Eastern Europe as being flat, stubbly wheat fields like Ukraine and some other areas. And I said, well, send me some photographs and a description of the park. And the first photograph they sent was of a church on an island in the middle of a lake with snow-capped Alps in the back. And I said, I think that we can do this. I think
you're like, interesting.
I think this would be a great sister park. And it is. It's a magnificent park. It's one of the most spectacular areas that I've ever been to in the world. They have very similar resources as far as fish and forests. And we have had a very close relationship with them ever since 2017 when we signed an agreement. We have exchanged staff over the past 7 years. We have sent researchers to them. We've done extensive aquatic ecology research for them on invasive species that are coming into their alpine lakes. We did eDNA sampling. We have our scientists over there just last month working with them. We've done education and outreach programs. We're trying to tie the 3 parks on 3 continents together in a education effort, and also tying in the universities in China, Slovenia, and the United States, Oregon State here for us, in any research into climate change or any similar park issues where we can share expertise and share research. So it's just been a wonderful relationship. And 2 months ago now, it was in May, we sent our trail crew over to Triglav because last summer they had a series of devastating storms and floods that washed their trail systems out. So we sent a crew over there for 3 weeks to help them repair their most critical trails in the Central Park in advance of their 100th anniversary celebration. And it was enormously successful. They say they learned a lot from our trail crews and their professionalism and techniques. And at the end of that period, at the 100th anniversary event, the president of Slovenia recognized the park agreement and recognized our trail crew, who was present at the event, for all the help and assistance that they had providing in making Slovenia's only national park whole again. So it's one of the best things that I've done in the National Park Service. And it shows you that people are the same everywhere and that everyone loves their natural areas and wants to protect them and wants to make sure that they are there for their children and their grandchildren as well as for themselves. So it's a great story for us, and they're two great relationships that I think will only grow
Yeah.
in the future.
Yeah, that's awesome. Can you share a little bit more about any other partnerships you have with the
Oh,
local communities around Crater Lake?
yeah, absolutely. So we have three main partner groups, and this is formal partnerships, not counting the partnerships that we have with agencies, with the tribes, with communities. These are just formal partners that have agreements with the park. And the first that
Okay.
was created was the Crater Lake Natural History Association. And this is a group
Okay.
that's authorized by Congress to support interpretation and education on the park. And they're the ones that operate our bookstores. And they sell
Oh,
books
nice.
and some small items, and all of the profits that come from their sales go back into our interpretive and education program. And recently, a little bit has also been going into some of our scientific research. But more importantly than
Mm.
the funds that they raise for us is that they provide staffing for us to work the visitor information desks in the summer and definitely in the winter when the Park Service just doesn't have the staffing anymore to do that. So it's a very
Hmm.
important group of people that back us up and that provide us direct assistance for employees that we have lost. The second group is the
Hmm.
Friends of Crater Lake. That group was
Hmm.
created in 1993, and it was envisioned originally as a fundraising group. But what came together was more of a grassroots group of people who loved the park and work together with the park. And they have been involved in on the ground projects. They will have a work weekend every year that lasts a weekend. They will come and they'll do things like renovate a campground amphitheater or paint our entrance stations or clear trails. They also have
Hmm.
become involved with our sister park relationships. So they were over with us a
Cool.
couple of times when we had exchanges with our sister parks, and they serve as a sounding board for the sister parks who don't have those sort of philanthropic groups. That is not well known in Europe or Asia because the governments there
Hmm.
provide so much support for the parks. The local population
Mm.
doesn't quite understand philanthropy the way that we do it in the United States. So the Friends Group are great. They're growing. They help us continuously on a lot of different projects in the park. They're there to support us for special events like our rim ride, which I may get into a little later. The third is a
Mm.
fundraising group that was born of the centennial for Crater Lake for the park back in 2002. And they were created as a fundraising and support group to raise large amounts of money for projects that were beyond the scope of the park to do on their own that may not get funded through regular government funding. And one of the things that they've been
Hmm.
closely involved with is growing our endowment that was created 2002, got a specialty license plate with the state of Oregon, and the funds
Oh.
from those specialty license plates come to our Science and Learning Center endowment. And the Crater Lake Trust has done a lot of work to help grow that endowment, including redesigning our plate just the year before last. The plate was designed in 2002, and since then, it's become a little dated, and the technology for colorful plates has evolved. And there are a number of competitive plates now in Oregon. So they funded the redesign and the reprinting and recall of all of the old license plates. And we now have brand
Oh.
spanking new, beautiful Crater Lake
Heck
license
yeah.
plates for Oregonians. A one time fee of $30 goes into this foundation endowment, and that supports science, research, education, and partnership programs like our international programs. And when I arrived, the
Mm.
fund was just over $1 million. And through judicious use and cooperation with the Oregon Community Foundation and the Crater Lake Trust, that endowment has now grown to over $10 million. So it's very helpful in
Wow.
supporting things that we could not normally do with appropriations, special projects. So the Crater Lake Trust and
Yeah,
their
that's
board has been
amazing.
very supportive of that and extremely supportive of our international partnership relationships. They have also been to our sister parks, and they have supported exchanges where staff from the other parks, the sister parks, have come to the United States to look at our operations and learn best practices from us.
Is an endowment fund common in across national
There,
parks, or is that
there
unique
are
to
a
Crater Lake?
few. Acadia has an endowment for their trails. It is
Okay.
not common, and it is a benefit that many parks don't have, because it can
Yeah.
help us do not our basic work. The basic work that we do essentially must be funded by Congress through allocation, but it helps us do the additional measure of quality things that we could not do with our basic appropriations. And because the park
Right.
does not hold the funds, they're managed professionally through the Oregon Community Foundation. Those funds are able to grow in a way that appropriated funds could not grow. So it's a great investment for the people of the state of Oregon, as well as for everybody in the country that loves Crater Lake. But you can only get a license plate if you're an Oregon resident.
Right. Makes sense. Can you share more about the rim ride that you mentioned?
Yeah, the rim ride is a bicycle ride that was created from a request many years ago by one of our congressional delegation to have a motor vehicle free day in the park. And because the park is so large and we have things like the Crater Lake Lodge, creating a day or a weekend where no motor vehicles are permitted was an extreme challenge. We couldn't have people carrying their luggage 10 miles up the mountain to the lodge on a bicycle. So, sort of as a compromise, we came up with an idea to close just Rim Drive, or at least 25 miles of Rim Drive, and allow bicycles only on that section for one weekend of the year. So we started it about 11 years ago in 2013. And the first year, the weather didn't cooperate. We had sleet and ice, and we had about 200 bicyclists. All we did was we swung the gates closed and said, have at it. You have 25 miles of road that you can ride on. Well, it quickly became evident that we needed to do something to support that, because there's not water, there's not other support functions out there when the road is closed. So over the next couple of years, we started providing water. We would have some water stockpiled, and the event started to grow. It grew from a few hundred to 1,000. And then we realized that we didn't want to do it on one weekend, because people who came from a long way off and didn't know that this was happening said they couldn't experience Rim Drive because it was closed for the whole weekend. So we split it into two. It's now the first 2 Saturdays in September, which has a dual benefit. One is it allows people who are not bikers to experience Rim Drive on the second weekend day. And number 2, it gives us a 50% better chance of having good weather. So that it's not snowed out both weekends. So we worked with our partners, the Friends of Crater Lake, and our marketing partners, who are the regional destination marketing organizations like Travel Oregon, Discover Klamath, Discover Southern Oregon. We now operate rest stops that have food, water, first aid, bicycle repairs, 5 of them around the 33-mile Rim Drive. Those are often supported by sponsors who provide things like energy bars and energy drinks. That event has now grown to almost 6,000 people. It's the second largest bicycling event in the state of Oregon after the Bridge Pedal. The people have come from all 50 states and 20 different countries to ride this because it is an experience that can't be duplicated. You're riding for 25 miles with no motor vehicles, no emissions, no loud engines, nothing, around this gorgeous, spectacular view of Crater Lake with the snow cascades in the background. And is now expanded from bicycles to anything that's non-motorized. So we have bicycles built for 2, bicycles built for 4, people towing their dogs and children in bicycle trailers. A unicyclist or 2 does it. We have 2 groups of ski kids from high school ski groups that do the entire 33 miles on roller skis. And it's just like a big, fun event that people have said, it's remarkable. It changed our lives. We're going to come back and do it every year for the rest of our lives.
That's so cool.
The weather is beautiful. The people are friendly. Our volunteers are supportive and encouraging. And people have said frequently it's the best experience they've ever had in their life. Some people come back both days on both weekends to do it. And some people who are good bikers do it twice. They do the 33-mile circle one way, then they turn around and go back the other way. But it's great fun. It supports our Healthy Parks, Healthy People initiative. It is quiet. It is non-polluting. It's healthy. It's everything that meshes with the national park and visitors and our objectives. And I encourage you to come out September 7th or September 14th and experience it this year. It's a wonderful time. And there's no fee for the event.
I'm going to have to think about that. That is, long story short, and this is just a project I'm working on. I'm working on hopefully a documentary series where I tell the story of the parks through the park rangers' eyes and go on backpacking trips with park rangers. And so I'm doing my first one in the North Cascades in September. And so maybe I'll see if I can swing on,
Yeah,
add on
we have
the rim ride.
interpretive rangers and on bicycles out there. We have law enforcement, EMS rangers on bicycles out there. It's been a relatively safe ride. There's only been a couple of
Yeah.
serious injuries in the 11 years that we have done that. People are pretty well
Yeah.
behaved. And most of those are with bikers who are high speed bikers and they're going a little faster than they should, perhaps on a curve or
Yeah.
something. But it's really great. If you're interested in it, you can go to ridetherim.org, which is the website. I can provide that for you. And it's got a map
Rim.org.
and it's got all of the details.
That's really cool. That's very unique. Like I haven't heard of many other things like
Yeah,
that.
the
in the Park
Volpe
Service.
Transportation Institute looked at it and said it was one of the best practices for alternative transportation and people experiencing the park. And as I said, people just rave about it. And they come now with all kinds of crazy outfits. I saw people dressed as bananas and parrots and feathers on their heads and doing the whole thing. It's just, it's a wonderful experience. We did open it to e-bicycles a few years ago. And I have to tell you one anecdote that was very heartwarming. A couple, 81 and 70 years of age. The husband was 81. The wife was 78 years of age. I'm sorry. They came and they did the 25-mile closed section. And both of them told me they had had open heart surgery within the last 6 months. And because they were able to use the pedal assist e-bikes, they were able to do the 25-mile section. And they said it was one of the best things that they've ever done in their life. And so
that's very endearing.
Enabling people to use the park and see the park in a different way than through the windshield of a car. And almost everyone who has done it, even the ones that said it was the hardest thing they've ever done in their life, because it is a lot of elevation change, they said they wouldn't have missed it for the world.
Wow.
So check it out. I will send you the website.
Add it to the bucket list.
Make sure I get you the right link so that I didn't give you the wrong link so that you can look at it. But it has photos and testimonials on that as well. But it's just a very fun event. And as I said, what could be better than seeing a national park on a non-polluting method of transportation that's totally quiet with other people doing the same?
Yeah, and without being afraid of a car hitting you.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons that we did it initially. The senator who was interested in doing this wanted a safe experience for people to experience the park without the risk of running into an automobile.
Can you share a little bit more about the Volunteer Ski Patrol and the role they've played in the park?
Yeah, the Volunteer Ski Patrol has a long and storied history with Crater Lake. Crater Lake, obviously, as we said at the beginning of the interview, it's a snow park. It's a winter park, one of the snowiest areas in the country, and actually the snowiest inhabited area. Mount Rainier and Paradise get more snow than we do, but they don't have people living there. We have people living right at the 6,000 and 7,000 foot level where we get 500 plus inches of snow a year. So there was a need as winter recreation grew to have some response capacity. So the Crater Lake Ski Patrol is a volunteer organization that grew up mostly starting with some of the park rangers who had their friends who would come in on weekends and go out and assist visitors who needed help, assist with search and rescue. And that's been a very strong program over the years. But what has happened recently is our use has shifted. In the past, it was mostly diehard cross-country skiers and telemarkers who would go out and ski around the entire Rim Drive, 33 miles. So we needed ski patrollers who wanted to and were able to go out and check on those folks and maintain conditions. Now we have a lot more visitors who just come and stay within 1 mile of Rim Village and represent risks. They're not experienced winter users so much. A lot of them like to sled down sometimes the roofs of the building, which we discourage. But they just like to view the lake in winter, or maybe snowshoe. Snowshoeing has become very big at the park. So most of our use is now focused in a much smaller area around Rim Village. So the need to have people who are experienced cross-country skiers that like to ski in the backcountry is much less than it was in the past. Most of our need is dealing with people, even dealing with parking. Because in wintertime, because of the restrictions of the snow, parking becomes as big a problem as it is in the summer. And at peak periods during
Yeah.
holidays, sometimes there was an hour wait just to get into the parking lot in Rim Village because there was no
Wow.
space available. So we're needing to transition the ski patrol to a function where they work with people who are less oriented to backcountry skiing and more oriented to the front
Hmm.
country snow experience and what we call PSAR, which is pre-search and rescue.
Hmm.
You want to be out talking to people, delivering safety messages, seeing that they don't get themselves into situations that require a search and rescue. So we're
Right.
transitioning the group and hoping that they will come along and that we will have people be willing to do some of the backcountry work, but at a much lower level than what we've had in the past, and be interested with working
Right.
people in the front country and in Rim Village who maybe have never even seen snow like that before and have just come up from
Yeah.
San Francisco or Seattle or Portland or somewhere just to see what deep snow like that is all about. And they don't need somebody to ski out to them with a rescue package when they're 15 miles out on a backcountry trail. They just need someone to keep them from falling into the caldera or chasing their dog or their children into the caldera and getting themselves in trouble.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. The PSAR program was developed in the Grand Canyon, right?
I believe so. I believe that was one of the initial places.
Okay.
Hard to say. Those things can start in multiple places at once, and then one place will get the credit for being the place that it started. But I would
Yeah.
have a feeling that
Yeah.
that a PSAR type activity was probably in the works at several of the large parks, and Grand Canyon might have been the first to actually name it PSAR.
Kind of talking about folks skiing around the lake and biking around the lake. Can you share some of the most impressive physical feats folks have achieved within the
Oh,
park?
yes. It's not a park like Rainier or Denali where you have people doing spectacular things at 20,000 feet in elevation, but it is a very challenging
Right.
environment in winter and in summer. So there is a group of people that has a challenge to summit all 8 of the peaks that are over 8,000 feet in the park within 24
Whoa.
hours. That's quite the
Whoa.
challenge. Some of them are fairly easy to summit because there are roads or parking areas that are somewhere near the top. One of them, Cloud Cap, is just a really short jaunt from the parking area up to the highest point, over 8,000 feet. But some of them are quite long. So summiting all 8
Hmm.
peaks over 8,000 feet in 24 hours is a pretty significant event. Every year, in addition to the rim ride that we have a rim run, and that consists of a marathon, a half
Ooh.
marathon, and I believe a 5K. So running a marathon at 6 to 8,000 feet is also quite a challenge. But every year we have the maximum
Yeah.
number of people sign up for that. I believe it's 500 and complete that marathon
Wow.
run all along Rim Drive. I mentioned talking about the rim ride that we have. Roller skiers, I think it's an amazing feat that we have young people that can roller ski 33 miles with a 6,000 foot elevation change in just a period of a
Yeah.
few hours.
That's a lot.
Just something that happens routinely is the trail from Cleetwood Cove parking area down to Cleetwood Cove itself on the lake is the only way that you can access the lake. And it's a 1.1 mile trail, but it's very steep and it has a more than 700 foot elevation gain. So everyone's always trying to set the record for that. And someone ran up that distance on soft pumice soils in under 11 minutes. I think that was quite a feat
Wow.
to do that. We had an Olympic athlete who had been in, I believe, the Olympics in Barcelona. He was approaching 40. And he came up and he said, I'm an Olympic athlete. I can beat that time of 11 minutes. And I said, you might want to reconsider because we're at elevation and you've been living at sea level and you haven't been training for a few years. He said, no, I says, no problem at all. So he ran up ahead of us. And when we got to the second switchback, which was only maybe a fifth or a sixth of the way up, he was panting with his hands on his knees and said, my lungs have never burned this much in my entire life. So
You're like,
running
well,
up the
we told
trail
you.
in less than 10 minutes is quite a feat. The other one that I can
Yeah.
think of is we had some long distance swimmers from San Francisco who, when we allowed that before we became really concerned with the invasive species, they swam from Cleetwood Cove the 5 to 6 miles across the lake to Chasky Slide and back again without stopping in water that was 50 some degrees in temperature. I think that is an incredible accomplishment, one that I would not want to try to do one that unfortunately you can't duplicate again because of the issues of long distance swimmers requiring flotation and other devices as safety backups.
Mm.
So we have to prohibit those from happening. But someone swimming 10 to 12 miles across that lake and back in those cold temperatures with rough, choppy waters was quite a physical feat.
Yeah, that's pretty intense, I would say, for sure. And then, kind of two more questions to wrap us up for our time. But can you share some of the biggest challenges you think Crater Lake faces?
I can give you challenges off the top of my head, but I would obviously miss some of the best ones. So, the very first thing that we're looking at right now, and I think this is common to almost all national parks, is that we are managing an increasing crush of visitors with fewer and fewer people and fewer resources. And when I say fewer and fewer people, I mean fewer and fewer staff. Right now, we are at a significantly lower number of staff than we had 10 or 12 years ago, and our visitation numbers are up 80 to 100%. So at some point you reach a critical mass where you just can't get to things that you need to get to. I answered a complaint just a day or two ago from someone that took a photograph of a trash can that was out on Rim Drive in a fairly remote location that was somewhat overflowing. There was a little bit of trash on the ground and there was some
Mm.
trash coming out of the can. Those cans are emptied 4 times a day. And unfortunately, we have 20% of the custodians that we attempted to hire on staff. And with people
Wow.
becoming more and more and more interested in visiting Crater Lake, it's difficult not only for maintenance of facilities, it's difficult for people who are presenting programs. Instead of 8 or 10 or 12 people at a night sky program, we now have 100. We have to limit it because there's only so much space in the building where the program starts. And then, even more
Yeah.
critically, we have a significant imbalance between the number of staff that we have to respond to incidents, whether it be a search and rescue, a car crash, a law enforcement incident. If you have 6 incidents occur at one time and you have 5 rangers on patrol, someone's going to get left behind. So it's very
Yeah.
difficult for us to prioritize and reprioritize our staffing and the placement of projects to provide the best services and the best experience for visitors in the safest manner. The
Yeah.
second thing is all of that is exacerbated by trying to manage the impacts of climate change and the environmental
Yeah.
and social changes that those things bring. The heat at the park this year reached the all-time record that we've had. It's never been
Oh, man.
hotter than 90 degrees at Crater Lake, and we touched on that again last week. That's causing not only more stress for visitors that are out in those conditions, but it's causing changes
Mhm.
to the forest, to the meadows, to the environment for the flora and fauna that we've got there, and also it's increasing fire risk and fire
Yeah.
danger. So it's making us do a lot more work in fuels reduction and fire hazards reduction in areas where we have more visitors. Related
Mm.
to the first issue and challenge is recruiting and retaining staff. It's not always a question of not having enough money. It's often a question of just not being able to get enough people to agree to come to work. It's a
Yeah.
competitive modern work environment in which our work sites are almost always remote and in areas where housing is difficult to find. And it's often very expensive. If you look for rental housing or purchase housing around any national park, Glacier, West Yellowstone, Great Smoky Mountains, Yosemite, even Crater Lake, housing is scarce and it's extremely expensive. And it's getting more so because housing is being bought up for vacation rentals. So housing that
Mhm.
used to be available for our employees is now bringing in $300, $400, $500 a night as a vacation rental. So owners are not interested in renting to someone even at $1,000 or $2,000 a month when they can get $300, $400, $500 a night for their property
Yeah.
that's located outside a very desirable national park. So it's getting harder and harder to find people to come and work for us in these beautiful areas. Then the last one is managing new and sometimes competing uses of the park in a way that recognizes, okay, technology changes. It's 2024. It's not 1916 when the Park Service was created. And also society is different. So managing new and competing uses with that technological and societal changes becomes a challenge to keep the true mission of the National Park Service of protecting the parks while maintaining reasonable access in place. People want to fly drones. People want to do adventure
Yeah.
activities with bicycling, with GoPro cameras on their heads. They want to ski inside the caldera. They want to parasail. They want to paraski. It's just difficult to manage all of that in a way that there are not conflicts with other visitors and there are not impacts to the
Mhm.
natural resources.
Yeah, that's a lot. I say this time and time again that the superintendents have a lot going on and there's always things to keep you busy. That's
Yeah,
for sure.
drones are a real problem for us now because they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Drones have buzzed the
Mm,
boats on lake tours. Drones at Redwood National Parks have crashed and started forest fires. So it's just one element of new technology that becomes a challenge for us.
yeah. To wrap up our time together, and I want to thank you for just, sharing a little bit more about Crater Lake and about your experiences. What is something you wish everyone knew about Crater Lake, regardless of if they have or have not been?
What's surprising how much people do know about Crater Lake. Crater Lake has become
Yeah.
extremely popular lately. We're just shocked at the response that we get on social media. But I think the most important thing, one of the most important things that I have learned is that to everyone, this place is inspirational and sacred in a way I've never seen. And it has been
Mm,
to some people since time immemorial. The indigenous peoples of the Klamath tribes, as I noted, actually observed the eruption of Mount Mazama 77 years ago.
wow.
And they observed the lake filling into the caldera over 500 years. We tend to relate to things in a time frame of reference of our own lives and history. But the
Mhm.
features and wonders that you find in national parks don't really lend themselves to that one human lifespan point of view.
Yeah.
Park staff is often amused by an overlook that we have that's called Discovery Point, a location at the point that the lake was allegedly discovered by a lost miner in the late 1800s. We certainly know
Mm,
that people had seen and revered this place and all the environment around it for thousands of years prior to that discovery. And this place was and always should be honored as a sacred place for all the American people and actually all the people all over the world in perpetuity. National
mm.
parks have a specialness that can be lost in a moment, but the struggle to protect our parks is never ending.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I realized I forgot a very important question, which is what is your favorite snack for camping and hiking?
I think without question, it's beef jerky. It's easy to carry.
Mm,
It's great. It's lightweight. It's high energy. And I have to tell you one quick anecdote and I'll let you go. I was hiking in Killarney National Park in Ireland in a gale, 50-mile-an-hour winds. And I came up to the top of a ridge and there was a group of Germans there and they were huddling together, snacking on chocolate. And I got my beef jerky out and they said, "What is that?" And I said, "It's beef jerky." And they said, "Can we try some?" And I gave it to them and they said, "This is amazing. We don't get
ah,
this in Europe. And if we had it, it would be very expensive. And we're going to be looking for it now anytime we come to the United States because we think it's a great thing to carry on a hike like this."
it is. Yeah, that's awesome. You're spreading the love of beef jerky. So well done.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Craig.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about
Oh,
one of the most amazing places on the entire planet.
thanks so much for listening today. Who Runs This Park is presented by Expert Voice. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. Don't forget to subscribe down below and tell your friends about it. This ensures that we can continue telling the stories of our national parks. Check out everything Who Runs This Park does at Linktree/Who Runs This Park. That's linktr.ee/Who Runs This Park. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.